Hello, my name is Arno Schmitz, and in this tutorial I would like to show you how I use Photoshop's 32-bit mode to easily balance the lighting in my images. This is great for look development, and it can drastically change the mood of your images. I want to start off by showing the neutral output. You can notice that all the lights here are completely white and that the background is gray, and what's also important is that the IBL doesn't have any extreme colors in it. This will be a great base to start our editing. And then here are some examples on how we actually change the image to achieve a certain mood. In this first image I'm using a very big warm key light, and I'm contrasting this with a very harsh cyan rim. Also I'm adding a lot of grunge in the post-processing to get a very strong, grungy and moody feeling. When I was making all these lighting variants, one game I was playing a lot was Mortal Shell, and in this game there's an area called Falgrim that inspired the lighting for this image. The area in general is very green, it has this green mist, but there's also plenty of campfires. So the idea here is that there's a campfire just on the left outside of the view of the camera, and that's projecting this warm fire glow, while the rest of the environment is casting a green color on this character. In this variant I'm trying to emulate a typical photo studio. This lighting really shows off every aspect of the model. Unlike the first one, which was the neutral, here all the lights have actually tailored values, so the key is a lot more overpowering, giving the model some nice shape, but because all the lights are still neutral white, it's really good to show off all the texturing work on your model. Then this is my personal favorite. It uses a very high contrast with a warm bright key light that is suggesting a campfire on the left side of the just outside of the camera. I even added a few embers to reinforce the suggestion of a campfire being there. And then the background is suggesting a very dark, cold winter evening, which you can see by the very dark blue tones. And later in this video we'll go a little bit more into depth into color theory and explain why exactly this warm versus cold works so well. Here is a very experimental image. I tried to use neon colors, so I'm alternating very saturated cyans and red, trying to create something very striking. I don't think it really works very well with this subject matter, but I think it could work great for something more sci-fi or cyberpunk related. Then for this one I wanted to go extremely moody and foggy, so you can see here that I'm controlling the values a lot to draw all the attention to the face while fading the rest, so you're not really paying that much attention to it. Just like with the warm and cold, I'm using a complementary color scheme here with green and purple to add some contrast. So you might have been thinking, okay, relighting and Photoshop I understand, but what is 32-bit? So here's a little overview what I mean with 32-bit. If you go in Photoshop here to image mode, you can see we have these three options: 8-bit per channel, 16-bit per channel, and 32-bit per channel. And these are pretty much color modes, how many bits that are in a channel, and with a channel we mean the RGB channels. So I made three gradients here, 8-bit, 16-bit and 32-bit, to kind of explain what's going on. On the 8-bit that we're all used to working with, there are 256 steps of color. When we get into our color picker, you can see here that when I manipulate here, you can see that this number goes between 0 and 255, and that means there's 256 steps per RGB. So next up we got 16-bit per channel, which is already a lot better. So the way I like to think about it, that every step has another 256 steps in between, and that will lead to a total of 65,536 steps. So that's like a lot of color. And then here for 32-bit we got even more steps in between. It's floating point, but the more important thing is suddenly we have values that can go below 0 or above 1. So if we start playing around with the exposure, you can see if I darken or lighten, that actually here, once I zoom out, there's more information above 1 that gets revealed if I lower the exposure. And you can also see if I use the offset, that suddenly information below the black is revealed. We're not really that interested in negative values, but we're quite interested in the values above 1. And the most practical example I can show you is this. So we got here a render in 32-bit and 8-bit, and if I zoom in here, you can see this render is pretty bright, so we want to make it more moody. So we can use our exposure to bring it down, and you can see here these highlights get very ugly and gray. That's because the information here is white and it's clipped, so there's no information there. You can see also if I use levels to bring it down, it's completely clipped. And now in the 32-bit version we can do the same, and you can see here if I start bringing the exposure down, there's actually a lot of information that gets revealed here in the highlights. So instead of turning into a muddy gray, we can suddenly see all the scratches that are hidden within the highlight. And you can see it doesn't matter if I use levels or exposure, pretty much any manipulation tool will expose the detail that's there. So that's the main reason we're using 32-bit images for this workflow. Another reason is, if we go back to this example, on 8-bit there can be a lot of what we call banding. That's because if there's just 256 steps, that means if we start doing a lot of levels and curve manipulations, some of these steps will be distorted so much that there's nothing to see in between, so you're going to get these ugly banding strips. That's why I like to edit in 16-bit after I'm done with all the 32-bit steps, but in general 8-bit doesn't have the amount of detail. So even if you don't want to use the benefit of having values above 1 in 16-bit, the extra steps you have here is also of a huge benefit to avoid things like banding in your image. So that's pretty much the basics of bit per channel. And now we'll go into Maya and I'll actually show you how to extract a 32-bit image out of your rendering software. So here we are in Maya. Here you can see my lighting setup. I got 4 lights and 1 HDR. The main thing you want to focus on here is the light direction and the light size. That will determine if you have soft or harsh shadows. And then what's very important for this workflow is that you keep the light color neutral. So what I like to do is just have a swatch that's completely white and only use the intensity to set the brightness. So I'll walk you through every light and what they do. So first we have the key light. In the render it will look something like this. Then we have our front fill, which is just a giant fill light. Then we have the rim from the right to just kind of give a nice rim to kind of pull it apart from the background. Then we have the rim on the left side, and this will just give a nice bit of sheen and also help to separate the torso from the arm. Finally we have the HDR, and that will of course give all the nice reflections in the armor. As a combined result it will look something like this. So as we mentioned in the earlier part, making sure the output is in 32-bit is very important. So for that you want to go to your render settings, and then in here you want to set 2 things. Every renderer pretty much has its own way to set the frame buffer to 32-bit. The one I'm using is Mental Ray. So for that you go into the scene and you make sure your data type is set to RGBA float 32-bit. You can see here we have like all kinds of options. Then when you're batch rendering, it's very important that your file format is set to something that supports 32-bit. In my case I prefer OpenEXR. When we want to do renders, you also need to make sure about setting your file format correctly, and you do that as the following. So once you do a render, you want to make sure when you go to save image, you just press the square and you want to make sure you save the raw image and not color managed image, because this will put a gamma curve on top of your image to compensate for the screen. So you just have to do that once, and once this is set correctly to raw image, Maya will remember that and you can just save your image here using any format that supports 32-bit. I prefer EXR. So here we fast forwarded a bit to me finishing all the renders. So here you can see the EXR files for every single light, and now I'll show you how to import them into Photoshop. So usually when you import EXR files, you're going to get this little pop-up, and I always choose to have an alpha channel and not transparency. So you'll have to do this for every single file, and I kind of just hold enter. There we go. Now they're all loaded, and now we're just going to build one scene where all of these will work together. So I'm going to put the IBL at the bottom because for me that makes the most sense, but you can structure it however you like. Then I'm going to put a solid color on top with a value of 1. I'm going to call both of these IBL. And this fill will be set as a multiply. I'm going to put these in a layer called IBL. As we open here the dialog box for the color, you can see in 32-bit mode the color picker also has this intensity, which is pretty much a multiplier, and you can see here the correct value, so not the Photoshop 255, but white is expressed as 1 and black is expressed as 0. So you can see here a brightness of 100% with the intensity 0 is just what we're used to, but then we can add stops, and those would just pretty much do times 2. So a stop of 1 does 2, a stop of 2 does 4, a stop of 3 does 8, a stop of 4 does 16, etc. And you can see here the results, how this brightens the image. So besides the stops, you can also see we can change the color, and this way we can change the lighting. So let me put some more passes into the scene to see how they all react together. So next up we're going to do key, because that's the most important light, and again we're going to put in a solid color of 1, and we're going to set this to multiply. And you can see here again we can change the color. Let's say I make a completely red key. If we go back in Maya, that kind of relates to Maya, to putting a completely red key in here. And here you can see this is not making that much of a difference because all the other lights are active. But if I just show the key, I'm pretty much getting the same result. But as you can see, the red wasn't making much of a difference, and that because light is additive. So linear dodge in 32-bit mode is the same as adding light. So you can see here how that works. So let me put this back to 1 and continue adding lights to kind of show you how it works, building the structure of the file. So the next step is the fill, putting that one in, again repeating the structure of putting a solid color in here, set to multiply, and again we want to add this to the result. So now to show a better example, let's say we pick a red key and a blue fill. We're getting this kind of interesting result. If we go back to Maya, we have the red key still active. If I'm going to open my fill and I'm going to turn this to blue, you can see, of course, this is a very crude preview in the viewport, but this is pretty much giving us the same result. Next up, we're going to put in the rims. So first I'm going to put in the rim on the right side because that's the biggest contributor of light. And again, putting a solid color in here, setting it to multiply and setting this to add. And let's say if we make this green and go back into Maya, we unhide this, put it to green, you can see how this relates. So let's again put all these back to whites because we want to have a neutral starting point. The whole idea behind this workflow is that rendering in Maya is very costly. It's going to take you a lot of time to render out all these passes. So it's better to look dev here because you can see it's very easy to change a specific value and get something interesting. And then once you're done, you could do your final render using these values in case you want to do a turntable or something. Or you could literally just leave it as this if you just want to do a single image. So rim left is the next one. So here we're importing the rim left, again naming it properly, making a solid color layer, deleting the mask, naming it rim left, then setting the fill to multiply and the folder to linear dodge. And now we have our exact lighting setup in Maya replicated in Photoshop. Finally, I just want to put all these in a group called neutral because at the moment this is our neutral lighting setup. Then outside of the scope of this video, I made a bunch of helpers. So these are like RGB trims, RGB mask, I made a depth and I made two types of AO, a very narrow AO and a very wide AO. So I'm just going to import these into our file, as you can see here. And then lastly, it's very nice to have a background to help us kind of preview the image better, because at the moment we're looking against a black background and that can kind of distort our sense of brightness. So for this, the helpers can already come in use. So here, if you control click on a channel, you select it. That's actually what these RGB masks are useful for. When holding Control Shift, I'm just adding all the three channels together, and that gives me a selection of white. And then again, in here we can add a solid color, and we can kind of change the color to a gray. And actually I noticed this layer needs to be inverted. So there we go. I think it's a little bit too bright, something more like this. And now I'm going to save this as a PSD, and then we can move on to the next step. For this step I prepared a mood board, because now we're deciding what type of image we want to create, what kind of mood we want to kind of show to the audience. I decided to kind of lean into the world building aspect of making a fantasy character. So in the medieval times there's pretty much no artificial light sources, so we need to rely on natural light only. That means for warm lights we have the sun during the day, so we can also have sunsets, etc. And we have fire. Both of these are warm sources, and then this is kind of balanced out with the blue in the sky, and this creates a complementary color scheme. And a really easy way to map out your color schemes is to go to a website called Adobe Color Wheel. So I'm just gonna type that in here, and on this site you can get all types of suggestions for your color scheme. So like I said, I'm working with a complementary color scheme, and actually this is already pretty accurate. So you can see here I can drag the colors to manipulate. So my key is usually very warm, that will be either a campfire, and then we have a lot of blues to kind of balance it out. So you can see here we can kind of play around. If you want to have multiple different color sources, we can go even crazier if you really have a lot of colors but you still want to have them be harmonious in the same family. You can also go for different color schemes like triad, or you can go for monochrome. But the idea is pretty much you pick your key light, which in my case would be something like fire, or the sun, which is very orange, and then this will give you the complementary colors for that. And if you kind of plug those in the fill layers that we were doing earlier, you're going to get very interesting results quite quickly. Okay, so let's get started with the actual artistic work here. So the original render that I'm very happy with has an orange and blue like this. So we got a strong orange key and then a very dark blue as our fill. So of course I don't want to repeat myself. If I would do, it would be as simple as kind of putting a strong orange here and like a blue here, and then of course we need to tweak all the others. The IBL in this case would also be very blue, and you can see we're starting to get that specific look. But in this case I want to create something new and fresh, so I want to flip the idea. So we're going to create a nice orange as our fill, and we're going to go for a blue as our key. And actually this rim would also be nice as a blue color. And then this left rim, let's take a look. Yeah, I think actually cool would work as well. And then we can check what is the most complementary IBL if we want to go warm or cool. And I think actually cool is the nicest. So you can see we have all kind of shades of cyan and a blue. The thumbnail is white because we put a high intensity, but if you can see here, it's actually blue. We put a blue key in like that. So what I like to do is pretty early put a background in my scene, so we're not working against something neutral. So I already prepared this in a previous file, so I'm just going to copy that in. So here you can see if everything is working correctly. And I would say we need a stronger light from the front for sure. And now I'll show you some cool tricks that are not completely physically accurate but will help you a lot to create a cool design. So what I like to do is just have a black and white, and then we can make a radial gradient like this, and then we can put this to multiply, and that way you can see we can kind of vignette one light specifically, and that's kind of like putting a fall off on your spotlight, for example. So that's very useful. Another thing that's very useful is to make a completely black layer, and then you can paint with a soft brush elements that you think are blowing out. So for example, this area on the pants is blowing out at the moment and it's causing a lot of attention to itself. And you can see it's definitely this layer that's responsible, because if I turn this layer off, everything else kind of looks pretty nice and in balance. So what we can then do is we can take our appropriate side brush and put a low opacity, and I'm just gonna go over this area and put a little bit of black here, and also here. It's a little bit too much. So by just tapping it softly, we can kind of fix all those blown out highlights. Let's say we're happy with this. I think this is looking pretty cool. Now we just want to put in some AO, for example, to make sure everything works well. So we're just going to make a new layer called extras, for example, and I'm just going to drag these in here. Of course, AO always needs to be set to multiply, and we definitely don't want to go too overboard with this, so we can just add a little bit of AO. Then also here we got our depth pass, and depth, we can do two cool things with it. You can use it as a depth of field to kind of blur out, but you can also use it as a fog. Curves and levels work a little bit weird in 32-bit because you can actually go over your value of 1, which can lead to very weird results on masks. So I just made a 16-bit version of this, and now here I'm just gonna use my levels to control a mask. And what I'm gonna do in this mask is create a certain level of fog. So you can see here, by inverting that depth and clipping it, we can kind of create a very cool fog. And then of course I probably wouldn't do it that strong, so we can have a nice subtle fog. And then the RGB masks are nice if you want to change certain colors. They can come in handy with grading. I'll show you what the use could be for this, but in general I'm pretty happy with it. So on the red channel here I got all the brass trims of this character. So by control clicking that channel, you create a mask. And then here we could do, let's make a new group called corrections. I can put a hue saturation in here, and I could actually change these trims to any color I want. That's a very extreme example, but for example, if they turn out to be a little bit too yellow or not yellow enough, I can play with the saturation, or I could play with the lightness and kind of make sure they fit better into the scene. So one very important part of getting these very different looks, as I'm showing here, is to do some post-processing on your image. So I'll show you how that works as well. So I'm just gonna copy my entire image and make a new flattened layer out of it, and then I'm just gonna go here. Now most of our filters are grayed out because we're working in 32-bit, so at this moment I want to convert my image to 16-bit. And now we're getting into all of HDR toning. You can just use exposure and gamma if we don't want to change our image at all. You got highlight compression, which will make sure anything that's clipping will be brought down to an acceptable level. Actually, this looks pretty cool. We got equalize histogram, and we got local adaptation. And I actually usually do local adaptation, and this creates this very HDR look where it's trying to push everything into a very readable level, so everything shows up. And then now this image is 16-bit, and what I do now is I immediately paste the original over, and then I can kind of control how much detail I want to show. If I want to have this fake HDR effect, if I want to have the original. And usually I like to go a little bit in between to reveal a little bit more of the nice modeling I've been doing. And then now my favorite tool for doing some final edits is the camera raw filter. So here we can do some exposure, we can change the contrast, we can mess around with the highlights, we can do texture, which can get very nice effects. Also clarity for the same reason, can add some nice grunge. But the presets in here are really good, so I always like to go in and mess around with the presets, try to get a look that's very striking. I like this one a lot, the warm shadows, so I'll definitely be taking this. And usually I do a few and then I'll start blending them in together. This one could be nice. Just kind of using this very contrasty one on luminosity, so I don't mess around with the colors and kind of add a lot of grunge. And then this very warm one might be cool on color. Yeah, that's very nice actually. And then of course I want to bring it down a bit because yeah, it's kind of messing up the colors. So now we can do another one on top. I made a new flattened copy. And we can change the temperature to kind of get a very warm or a very cool result. So I'm gonna push it down a little bit to the cool side because the filter made it very warm. And you also have tint, which can make it more green or purple. I think the green is looking pretty cool. Now I can also look more clearly at other things of the images. For example, on this character the green can sometimes be a little bit problematic. So then here I can change the hue of the green to be more of a blue green or more of a yellow green. I think in this case the yellow actually works a little bit better. I can also make it less or more saturated and, for example, darker. I think that's working pretty cool. Then another thing that we can do is, since this is a fantasy character, I always like to add a little bit of bloom. So we just make a copy. We give it a nice big blur. Can do some overlay. And this makes it always like a little bit more fairy tale like. And lastly, I'm going to repeat the vignetting technique to really draw the attention to his face. You don't always need to use multiply. Sometimes some of the other effects can work quite well. Lastly, you want to make sure you break up the CGI look of things, and for that usually I do some kind of noise. So for this I always do a nice gray layer and then I just add some noise like this, and then I put that layer to overlay so you don't actually destroy any of your detail. And that's pretty much it. And then you can see it here against the original non-composited version, and you can see how much difference that final composite makes to getting the image looking cool. Here is the final result of this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it and it was useful to you in any way. This was my first YouTube tutorial, so please let me know if this is something that was helpful to you and if you would like me to make more of these type of videos in the future.